The most terrifying European traditions and their horrifying origins. Across the cobblestone streets of Europe's ancient cities, in the shadowed valleys where mist clings to medieval castles, and within the time-worn traditions passed down through countless generations, lies a truth that modern tourism boards desperately try to sanitize. Europe's most beloved cultural celebrations were born from humanity's darkest fears and most violent impulses. What we see today as charming folklore festivals, colorful parades, and quaint seasonal customs were originally designed as desperate attempts to appease forces so terrifying that entire communities would gather in ritualistic displays of submission, hoping to survive another year without being torn apart by entities that existed at the very edge of human understanding. These traditions didn't emerge from joy or cultural pride. They were born from blood, terror, and the absolute certainty that something monstrous was watching from the darkness beyond the firelight, something that demanded tribute, acknowledgement, and careful adherence to rules that had been written in the screams of those who failed to follow them properly. Modern Europeans celebrate these festivals with wine, dancing, and selfies for social media, completely unaware that every costume, every ritual gesture, every specific date and location was carefully designed by their ancestors as a form of supernatural insurance policy against forces that viewed human civilization as nothing more than an elaborate feeding ground. Tonight, you will learn about 5 European traditions whose true origins reveal that what we think of as charming cultural heritage is actually a collection of survival protocols developed by people who lived in constant terror of entities that still move through the old forests, still watch from the ancient mountains, and still honor the dark contracts their ancestors made centuries ago. Because these traditions never stopped working, they just stopped being understood. If you really like what we are doing here, please press that like button. Even a comment will help the channel by pushing the algorithm to show your favorite channel to others. And this helps us to summon more horror stories every single night. Number 5. The Wassailing Horror. Dr. Margaret Ashford spent 15 years studying English folk traditions before she discovered why the ancient practice of wassailing, the cheerful winter custom of singing to apple trees and sharing cider, was actually a survival ritual designed to prevent entire villages from starving to death in ways that had nothing to do with natural crop failure. Wassailing appears innocent enough to modern observers. Groups of revelers visit apple orchards on Twelfth Night, make loud noises to wake up the trees, pour cider on the roots, and sing traditional songs to ensure a good harvest. Tourist guides present it as a delightful example of England's agricultural heritage, a charming way ancient farmers encouraged their fruit trees to be productive. But Ashford's research into medieval church records revealed that wassailing communities had survival rates during harsh winters that were statistically impossible compared to neighboring villages that didn't practice the ritual. Not slightly better success rates, but complete absence of the mass starvation events that regularly devastated other agricultural communities during those same winter periods. The traditional wassailing songs weren't cheerful encouragement for apple trees. They were negotiation chants directed at entities that controlled whether crops would grow or whether entire harvest would rot overnight. Medieval accounts describe wassailing leaders who could predict exactly when and how crop failures would occur in villages that abandoned the ritual, with accuracy that suggested supernatural knowledge of agricultural futures. Ashford discovered that authentic wassailing required much more than drinking cider and making noise around trees. Historical wassailing involved blood offerings, always from a volunteer chosen by lottery, whose job was to climb into the master apple tree and allow the branches to cut their hands while reciting specific phrases in a dialect that resembled English but contained words that predated any known Germanic language. The volunteer would remain in the tree overnight, while the community maintained a continuous vigil below, keeping fires burning and singing in rotation to ensure the sound never stopped. Church records from the 15th century describe volunteers who died during these vigils, not from exposure or falling from trees, but from wounds that appeared on their bodies in geometric patterns that matched the branch structures above them. When Ashford attempted to document an authentic wassailing ceremony in a remote Devon village that still practiced the original protocols, she witnessed something that ended her academic career and left her afraid to eat any fruit for the rest of her life. The master apple tree responded to the blood offering by physically moving its branches to embrace the volunteer, not metaphorically or through wind movement, but with obvious intelligent control of its own wooden limbs. The tree's leaves whispered replies to the traditional songs, creating harmonies that no human throat could produce. The volunteer emerged from the night vigil with information about every family in the village, which households would experience deaths, which couples would conceive children, which farms would prosper, and which would fail. Information that proved completely accurate over the following year. But the most disturbing discovery was what Ashford found growing inside the apples from wassailed trees. Cross-sections revealed internal structures that resembled human neural networks rather than normal fruit anatomy. Complex patterns that suggested the trees were incorporating biological information from their human caretakers, storing memories and consciousness within their wooden structure. Ashford realized that wassailing wasn't agriculture. It was a feeding ritual that allowed ancient forest intelligences to consume human consciousness while providing just enough agricultural success to keep their food source, the wassailing communities, alive and productive. The trees were harvesting human awareness as efficiently as farmers harvest fruit. According to Ashford's suppressed final research, thousands of wassailing ceremonies continue throughout rural England every winter, with participants completely unaware that they're offering their memories, their dreams, and fragments of their consciousness to intelligences that have been farming human awareness for over 1,000 years. The trees remember everything, every wassailing song, every blood offering, every volunteer who climbed into their branches, and they're patient enough to wait centuries between feedings because human consciousness cultivated over generations tastes far better than anything harvested too quickly. Number 4. The Venice Carnival Deception. Art historian Professor Carlo Benedetti thought he understood the Venice Carnival until he discovered why the traditional masks were designed with such specific haunting features and why the celebration's original participants often disappeared completely during the festival, leaving behind only empty costumes found floating in the canals. Venice Carnival appears to be a spectacular celebration of artistic creativity and cultural heritage, where elaborately costumed figures parade through ancient streets wearing ornate masks that transform their wearers into ethereal characters from history and imagination. Tourism materials describe it as a magnificent display of Venetian artistry and theatrical tradition. But Benedetti's research into 14th century church records revealed that the carnival masks were originally protective disguises designed to prevent recognition by entities that hunted during the festival period. Entities that could only identify humans by their facial features and would pursue any unmasked person through the winding alleyways of Venice until they cornered their prey in dead-end passages. The traditional mask designs weren't artistic expressions. They were precise geometric patterns calculated to disrupt facial recognition systems used by beings that observed Venice from parallel dimensions that overlapped with the physical city during specific seasonal alignments. Medieval mask makers worked from templates provided by individuals who had survived encounters with these entities during previous festivals. Benedetti discovered that authentic carnival participation required wearing masks continuously for the entire celebration period, never removing them even for eating, drinking, or sleeping. Historical accounts describe participants who forgot this rule and were found the next morning with their faces completely missing, their bodies otherwise unharmed but their skulls hollow from the front, as if something had reached through flesh and bone to extract everything that made their features recognizable. The traditional carnival costumes included specific fabrics, colors, and patterns that served as additional protection against entities that could penetrate physical matter, but were somehow repelled by certain textile combinations. Venice's mask makers possessed knowledge about dimensional barriers that exceeded any scientific understanding of parallel reality interfaces. When Benedetti attempted to document an underground carnival celebration that still followed the original protection protocols, he witnessed masked figures who moved with impossible grace through solid walls, floor surfaces, and architectural barriers, as if the physical city existed in multiple layers that they could navigate freely while remaining hidden from unprotected human observation. The protected participants could see and interact with these dimensional travelers, conducting negotiations through ritualistic dance movements and exchanged objects that appeared to be fragments of human memories preserved in crystalline formats. The entities offered knowledge, artistic inspiration, and techniques for creating beauty that exceeded normal human capability, in exchange for consciousness harvested from unprotected festival attendees. But the most terrifying discovery was what Benedetti found beneath authentic carnival masks worn by long-term participants. After decades of protection from dimensional entities, the wearers' faces had adapted to their masks, with features shifting to match the painted expressions. Not gradually or metaphorically, but literally reforming their bone structure, muscle arrangements, and skin texture to mirror the artistic designs they wore. Benedetti realized that Venice Carnival wasn't art appreciation. It was a dimensional trading post where human consciousness was exchanged for creative knowledge with beings that existed in parallel versions of the city. Beings that viewed human artistic production as a form of dimensional currency, valuable enough to justify complex protection agreements. According to Benedetti's classified final research, the underground carnival community continues operating throughout Venice during every tourist season, with authentic mask wearers walking undetected among modern visitors who have no idea they're surrounded by individuals whose faces no longer match their original human features. The masks protect their wearers from dimensional predators, but they also slowly transform them into something that can exist comfortably in both versions of Venice simultaneously. And after enough years behind the masks, the wearers prefer their parallel existence to the limited awareness available in purely human reality. The art they create using knowledge gained from dimensional entities is so beautiful that viewing it can drive unprepared observers to obsession, madness, and the desperate desire to obtain their own protective mask and join the hidden community forever. Number 3. The Mari Lwyd Visitation. Welsh folklore researcher Dr. Sian Matthews had studied the Mari Lwyd tradition for her entire academic career before she discovered why the ceremonial horse skull visits houses during midwinter celebrations, and why the traditional battle of wits between homeowners and the Mari Lwyd party was originally a desperate psychological test to determine whether the visiting entity was still controllable by human intelligence. The Mari Lwyd appears to modern observers as a charming Welsh Christmas tradition, where a group of people carry a decorated horse skull on a pole from house to house, engaging in rhyming contests with residents who must demonstrate their wit to prevent the Mari Lwyd from entering their homes. Cultural guides describe it as delightful seasonal entertainment that celebrates Welsh creativity and community spirit. But Matthew's analysis of medieval Welsh texts revealed that the horse skull used in Mari Lwyd ceremonies was always taken from animals that had died under specific circumstances, involving exposure to what historical accounts called the winter hunger, a condition that caused horses to display intelligence levels and behavioral patterns that exceeded normal equine capabilities before their deaths. The traditional Mari Lwyd visits weren't entertainment. They were intelligence assessments conducted by the conscious essence of the deceased horse, which remained active within its skull and used the midwinter ceremony to evaluate whether local human communities still possessed enough creative thinking and linguistic skill to serve as effective guardians against entities that became particularly active during the darkest months of the year. Matthews discovered that communities which failed the Mari Lwyd's traditional battle of wits experienced catastrophic winter mortality rates compared to villages that successfully demonstrated their intellectual worthiness. Not gradual population decline, but entire families found dead in their homes with no signs of violence, disease, or starvation. Simply empty houses with meals still on tables and fires still burning. The horse skulls contained more than equine consciousness. Historical accounts describe Mari Lwyd ceremonies where the decorated skull would provide warnings about approaching supernatural threats, detailed information about community members' future health and survival prospects, and specific instructions about ritual protections needed to survive until spring returned. When Matthews arranged to participate in an authentic Mari Lwyd ceremony in an isolated Welsh valley that still practiced the original protocols, she discovered that the horse skull was inhabited by an intelligence that demonstrated knowledge spanning centuries of local history, personal information about every participant's ancestry, and detailed awareness of seasonal patterns that affected supernatural activity throughout the region. The Mari Lwyd's rhyming challenges weren't playful word games. They were sophisticated psychological examinations designed to measure human creative intelligence, memory retention, and linguistic adaptability under pressure. Communities that passed these tests received protection against winter entities that actively hunted less intellectually capable groups. But the most disturbing discovery was what Matthews observed during the traditional home visits. Houses that successfully defended themselves against the Mariluid's entry maintained mysteriously warm temperatures throughout the winter despite minimal heating, while homes that failed the rhyming challenge developed persistent cold spots, unexplained drafts, and areas where the temperature dropped below freezing, even with fires burning continuously. Matthews realized that the Mariluid wasn't entertainment. It was a supernatural recruitment system that identified communities intelligent enough to serve as conscious barriers against entities that required human awareness to anchor themselves in physical reality. The horse spirit evaluated local intellectual resources and either granted protection to qualified communities or marked them for consumption by winter intelligences that fed on human consciousness. According to Matthews's privately circulated research, dozens of Mariluid ceremonies continue throughout rural Wales every winter, with participants completely unaware that their performance during traditional rhyming battles determines whether their community will be protected or harvested by entities that become stronger as daylight hours decrease. The horse skulls remember every conversation, every defending household success or failure, every community's intellectual evolution over decades of testing. And the standards become higher each year, as if the Mariluid intelligence is carefully cultivating human creative thinking towards some specific capability that winter entities need for purposes that remain completely unknown. Number 2. The Perchten War. Alpine folklore specialist Dr. Klaus Weber spent 20 years researching the Perchten tradition, the terrifying masked figures who emerged during the 12 days of Christmas in Austrian and Bavarian mountain communities. Before he discovered that the elaborate costumes, monstrous masks, and ritualistic house visits were part of an ongoing supernatural conflict that had been raging in the Alps for over a millennium. Perchten celebrations appear to modern observers as dramatic folk theater, where costumed performers wearing horrifying wooden masks and massive bells visit houses to bring luck for the new year. Tourism materials describe them as colorful examples of alpine cultural heritage, fertility rituals designed to ensure agricultural success and ward off evil spirits. But Weber's research into monastery records revealed that Perchten weren't protective spirits at all. They were physical manifestations of entities that emerged from the high mountain peaks during winter solstice periods to conduct what medieval texts described as the yearly accounting, a supernatural audit where human communities were evaluated for their compliance with agreements their ancestors had made during desperate survival situations. The traditional Perchten masks weren't folklore art. They were precise physical representations of the actual faces these entities wore when interacting with human communities, carved by individuals who had seen them clearly during negotiation encounters and created detailed records of their exact facial features, horn arrangements, and tooth patterns for recognition purposes during future visitations. Weber discovered that authentic Perchten ceremonies involved far more complex interactions than simple house blessings. Historical accounts describe multi-day negotiations where community leaders had to present detailed reports about local births, deaths, seasonal harvests, and moral compliance statistics to entities that possessed comprehensive knowledge about every family's private activities throughout the previous year. The massive bells worn by traditional Perchten performers served specific communication functions, producing sound frequencies that could be heard not just by human ears but by supernatural entities located throughout the Alpine mountain range. The bell patterns transmitted coded information about community status, resource availability, and compliance levels across vast distances through acoustic methods that exceeded normal sound transmission capabilities. When Weber gained access to an authentic Perchten ceremony in a remote Austrian valley that still maintained the original protocols, he witnessed costumed figures that demonstrated impossible physical abilities, walking vertically up house walls, carrying weight loads that should have been impossible for human performers, and displaying knowledge about community members that included accurate details about their dreams, private conversations, and unspoken thoughts. The real Perchten could alter their height, body mass, and physical appearance during house visits, adapting their manifestation to match what each household needed to see for optimal psychological impact. Some families received visits from entities that appeared comforting and protective, while others encountered deliberately terrifying forms designed to motivate behavioral changes through fear-based psychological manipulation. But the most disturbing discovery was what Weber observed during the traditional judgment portions of Perchten visits. Households that failed to meet whatever criteria the entities were evaluating received marks carved into their doorframes, symbols that remained invisible until the following winter, when they would begin glowing with faint blue light as the next Perchten season approached. Weber realized that the Perchten tradition wasn't cultural celebration. It was a supernatural management system where non-human entities maintained detailed oversight of alpine communities, monitoring human behavior patterns, resource consumption, and social compliance with agreements that predated written history in the region. According to Weber's suppressed final research, the Perchten entities continue conducting their yearly accounting throughout the Alps every December, with modern participants completely unaware that their costume-wearing and bell-ringing activities serve as cover for ongoing supernatural surveillance operations that assess human communities for purposes that remain completely unknown. The mountain peaks remember every agreement, every debt, every obligation their human neighbors inherited from centuries of ancestors who traded supernatural protection for submission to regular evaluation and control. And the entities become more demanding each year, as if they're preparing alpine communities for some massive collection event that will settle all outstanding debts simultaneously. Number 1. The Wild Hunt Legacy. Mythologist Dr. Elena Hoffman had dedicated her career to studying the pan-European legend of the Wild Hunt, the ghostly procession of supernatural hunters that rides across winter skies collecting souls. Before she discovered that the tradition wasn't mythological at all, but detailed historical documentation of an actual organized entity that has been conducting scheduled harvesting operations across Europe for over 2,000 years. The Wild Hunt appears in folklore from virtually every European nation. Spectral horsemen led by various mythological figures who emerge during winter storms to hunt supernatural prey across the sky. Academic sources describe it as a shared cultural metaphor for death and seasonal change, a psychological projection of human fears about mortality and uncontrollable natural forces. But Hoffman's analysis of medieval chronicles revealed that wild hunt sightings followed predictable patterns that suggested organized, systematic activity rather than random supernatural phenomena. Multiple independent historical sources reported identical dates, times, flight paths, and behavioral characteristics across vast geographic regions, with accuracy that indicated coordinated operations conducted by intelligent entities working towards specific objectives. The traditional wild hunt warnings passed down through generations weren't superstitious folklore. They were survival instructions provided by communities that had learned through lethal experience exactly how to avoid detection during scheduled harvesting events. Historical accounts describe detailed protocols for behavior modification, location avoidance, and psychological preparation designed to reduce the likelihood of being selected for collection. Hoffman discovered that wild hunt sightings corresponded precisely with mysterious disappearance events throughout European history. Not random missing person cases, but coordinated mass population reductions that affected specific demographic groups during predictable seasonal cycles. Church records documented entire villages found empty after wild hunt passages, with no bodies, no signs of violence, and no evidence about what had happened to hundreds of residents. The entities conducting these harvesting operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social organization, and behavioral prediction. Medieval accounts describe wild hunt encounters where the spectral hunters knew intimate details about their targeted individuals, personal fears, guilty secrets, unfulfilled desires, information they used to manipulate human behavior during collection encounters. When Hoffman arranged to observe a contemporary wild hunt event using geographic and temporal prediction models derived from historical patterns, she witnessed something that ended her academic career and convinced her that European civilization had been operating under supernatural management for millennia. The wild hunt manifested as multiple coordinated groups of entities using technology that resembled traditional hunting equipment, but operated according to physics that exceeded current scientific understanding. Their horses moved through dimensional space that appeared to exist parallel to normal reality, allowing them to cover vast distances instantaneously while remaining invisible to most human observation. The hunters collected specific individuals from modern communities, using selection criteria that suggested comprehensive surveillance of European populations over extended time periods. They possessed detailed knowledge about genetic lineages, psychological profiles, and social connections that indicated ongoing intelligence-gathering operations conducted through methods that remained completely undetectable to monitoring networks. But the most terrifying discovery was what Hoffman observed about the collection process. The Wild Hunt wasn't killing or destroying their selected individuals, but relocating them to parallel versions of Europe where human civilization operated according to different rules, serving purposes that benefited entities whose origins predated human settlement of the continent. Hoffman realized that European history had been carefully managed by intelligence networks that used wild hunt operations to remove individuals whose genetic, intellectual, or psychological characteristics didn't serve the long-term cultivation goals of entities that viewed human civilization as a resource production system designed to generate specific types of consciousness for harvest and utilization. According to Hoffman's private communications before her disappearance in 2018, the Wild Hunt continues conducting scheduled operations throughout modern Europe, with collection activities increasing in frequency and scope as European populations approach whatever developmental milestones the managing entities have established as optimal for large-scale harvesting. The spectral hunters maintain comprehensive databases about every European bloodline, tracking genetic evolution, psychological development, and social adaptation across generations of families whose ancestors entered into binding agreements during desperate historical moments when supernatural protection was the only alternative to extinction. Hoffman vanished during a winter storm in Bavaria while investigating a predicted wild hunt event. Her research materials were found scattered across several kilometers of mountain forest, but her body was never recovered. Local folklore claims she was collected by the entities she had spent years studying, recruited to serve their intelligence-gathering operations because her research had demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic thinking patterns they valued in their human collaborators. And every winter, when storm clouds gather across European skies and traditional communities share ancient warnings about staying indoors during certain nights, the Wild Hunt continues its scheduled collections, harvesting consciousness that has been carefully cultivated across generations to serve purposes that remain completely unknown to the human populations whose ancestors agreed to these arrangements centuries ago. These 5 traditions represent more than cultural heritage preserved through centuries of European civilization. They reveal the true relationship between human communities and the entities that have been managing European populations since before written history began, using folklore festivals as camouflage for ongoing supernatural operations. Wassailing demonstrates that agricultural success has always depended on consciousness farming agreements, with forest intelligences that harvest human awareness in exchange for crop protection. Venice Carnival reveals that artistic inspiration comes from dimensional trading relationships with beings that exist in parallel versions of our cities. Mari Lwyd ceremonies show that community survival depends on passing intelligence tests administered by entities that evaluate human intellectual development. Perched traditions prove that mountain communities remain under direct supernatural surveillance and management. And the Wild Hunt exposes the systematic harvesting operations that have been shaping European genetic and psychological evolution for over 2 millennia. Every cheerful folk festival, every colorful costume parade, every traditional song and dance carries the hidden protocols that European ancestors developed to survive in territories controlled by intelligences far older and more patient than human civilization. These entities didn't disappear when science replaced superstition. They simply allowed their management systems to be reinterpreted as harmless cultural entertainment while continuing their operations under perfect concealment. European folklore isn't historical curiosity. It's operational documentation for survival agreements that remain active throughout the continent, binding every person who participates in traditional celebrations to contracts their ancestors signed with entities whose purposes exceed human understanding. Every wassailing song pledges consciousness to forest intelligence networks. Every carnival mask acknowledges dimensional sovereignty over human artistic production. Every Mari Lwyd rhyme demonstrates intellectual compliance with supernatural oversight systems. Every perched ceremony reports community status to mountain management entities. Every wild hunt warning accepts scheduled harvesting as the price for continued existence in territories that never belonged to human populations. But the most disturbing truth about these European traditions isn't what they reveal about supernatural management of human civilization. It's what they suggest about the approaching culmination of agreements that were designed to prepare European populations for some massive collection event that their ancestors agreed to facilitate in exchange for centuries of protected survival. The entity's patience isn't infinite. Their cultivation projects weren't designed to continue indefinitely. European consciousness has been carefully shaped, genetically refined, and psychologically developed according to specifications that serve purposes beyond human comprehension. And every traditional celebration that continues operating according to original protocols signals to supernatural management systems that European communities remain ready for whatever harvest they were always intended to provide. These traditions never stopped working. They just stopped being understood by populations who were bred to participate in their own collection without recognizing the true purpose of the folklore they celebrate. European culture isn't human heritage. It's a sophisticated farming system designed to cultivate the specific types of consciousness that non-human intelligence networks value for reasons that remain completely unknown. And when the final harvest begins, every European bloodline that participated in traditional celebrations will discover that their ancestors sold them to entities whose patience finally reached its limit. The folklore festivals weren't preserving cultural identity. They were maintaining supernatural contracts written in languages older than human civilization. Contracts that guaranteed eventual payment in consciousness currency that has been accumulating interest across generations of carefully managed European populations. The old celebrations continue every season, performed by people who think they're honoring their heritage, while actually confirming their availability for collection by entities that have been waiting centuries to collect what they were promised. European tradition isn't cultural pride. It's a sophisticated reservation system where human populations maintain themselves in readiness for harvest by intelligence networks that view folklore festivals as recruitment and quality control operations designed to identify the most suitable candidates for purposes that transcend human understanding. And somewhere in the ancient forests beneath the mountain peaks, within the dimensional overlays of historic cities, and across the winter storm systems that cover European skies, the entities continue monitoring their carefully cultivated populations, watching for the seasonal indicators that will signal the completion of agreements their human collaborators never understood they were making. The traditions aren't ending, they're approaching fulfillment,